Hello, welcome to my channel, Moretta Threads. First of all, let me just say, I am so sorry that this tutorial has taken so long to come out. I made the first tutorial before I went away to Vietnam, and then I got engaged, and then when I got back, I had my sister's wedding and my boyfriend's best friend's wedding. So I just had a lot on. However, done now. I am hoping to try to get one tutorial out every week, and if I can, maybe even two. I think my issue is that I just try to put too much effort into like the production of things that I just end up dragging my feet and it all just takes too long. In today's tutorial, we are making this bag. So it's really important that you have already made the scrunchie because we build on the same skills that we've learned here. In the scrunchie, we learnt about the selvage, the grain line and notches, and a little bit about seamless construction, and we use those same skills but build on them now when we make this bag. Now here is the scrunchie that I wear all the time. It's made out of a lightweight poplin and I love it. And this is what it looks like in my hair. So I just do this. It's cute. I love it. I made another scrunchie, exact same tutorial, but different fabric. The fabric is a heavyweight linen, and I'll show you what this looks like. Like, to me, I find that too big. So I would say that when you're sewing, you will often hack or manipulate your sewing patterns to make them work better for you. What I would do, again, if I was going to alter this pattern, is I would reduce the length and maybe even the width so that I had a little less of a height on this and just less ruffling. So yeah, I'm sorry if you don't love that, but that is the nature of the beast of sewing. Sometimes you'll make something, you won't love it, and that's why a seam ripper is always going to be your best friend, because you're often going to have to go into things and make alterations. Anyway, I think that covers most things now, so we can get into the tutorial and make this bag. Now, the sewing pattern for the bow tie bag is comprised of three main components. For the main body of the bag, you have the outer layer, then you have the lining layer, and then you have the straps. For the outer layer, you need 50 centimeters. For the lining layer, you need 50 centimeters. And for the straps, you need 75 centimeters. If you're making the outer and lining layer of the bag out of the same fabric, then obviously you would just buy 1 meter, but I've given you the increments for each component in case you choose to do contrasting fabrics. For me, because I'm in Australia, I printed off the sewing pattern in A4 paper, and I always make sure I print page 1 to begin, just so that I can use the measuring box, measuring 1 centimeter or 1 inch, ensuring that the sizing is correct so that I can then print the remaining pages. From there, I gather everything together and I then trim away the right hand border and the bottom hand border all together. However, if you don't have a cutting mat, absolutely fine. Just manually cut them one at a time with a pair of scissors. Now, I don't remove the left and the top hand border because it just acts as a little buffer if I ever cut away too much or too little. And I just get the little arrows to connect to create an X, and then I place a small tab of sticky tape. So when you're assembling the pattern, it's really important that you just do little small tabs of sticky tape one at a time so that you can reconfigure the pattern if you need to. And then from there, once you're happy and you like the way that everything's looking, then you go in with the longer lengths of sticky tape. Now, if you have come from task 2, you'll remember that when we were looking at the sewing pattern, we touched on notches, grain line, and fold lines. In this sewing pattern, we do have all of those same features, but you might be able to see here the mistake that I've actually made. If you have a look, you'll see that I have the selvage of the fabric, and I accidentally placed my pattern pieces the wrong way, because remember that the selvage line needs to run parallel to the grain line, and that grain line is where those little arrow lines are. Technically, with this fabric, it doesn't actually matter. I could have just cut it out the way that it was, but sometimes calling yourself out on the mistakes that you make is helpful to other people. And generally, it is just good practice to follow those tips. So what we're looking at here are pattern pieces 1 and 2. Number 1 is the outer layer, and you're going to cut 2 pieces of that. And number 2 is a lining layer where we're going to cut 2 of the same. The easiest way to do that is generally just to fold your fabric over just enough so that we're not wasting any excess fabric, but we're cutting through 2 layers so that we have 2 of the exact same pattern pieces. So cut that out, ensuring that you're also cutting out the notches, and then place those pattern pieces to the side. I also forgot to mention before, when you're buying fabric for the straps, they need to be from a roll of fabric that is at least 140 centimeters wide. Now, similar to what we learnt in the scrunchie, looking at the fold line, you want to make sure that you have folded your fabric in half and you place that folded edge of the pattern piece flush to the bottom of the fold. Now for pattern piece 3, the straps, you're supposed to cut 4 of these. So just repeat this process 4 times. From there, I then want you to grab those pattern pieces and open them up lengthwise. So I'm going to put a little pin as a marker indicating a good side of the fabric for your reference. So currently, if there is a good side of the fabric, make sure that it is currently facing up. So those are my markers. I am looking currently at the good side of the fabric. I want you to grab that top piece and place it on top so that the good sides are now kissing each other and we're looking at the bad side of the fabric. From there, I just want you to line up your pieces together as best you can and then just pin the perimeter, not including one of the short sides. The reason for that is because you're going to just sew like a U shape and then leave one side open so that we can turn this inside out. Repeat that process with the remaining 2 straps and then bring that across to the sewing machine. Now, because we're still learning, a thicker seam allowance is our friend here, and we're just going to use the same seam allowance that we used in the scrunchie tutorial, which is 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Now locate the short side that doesn't have any pins where our opening will be. That's where you're going to start your stitch. So place the fabric under, put your sewing foot down, and we're going to start with a little back stitch, making sure that we're not going over the pin and that we're using that little paper guideline to use as our seam allowance. Now, when we get to these little corners, when we were doing the maze trace, as we got to one corner, we would put the needle down and then pivot the fabric. However, if you do that here, you're going to have to measure out 1.5 centimeters each time. And you can do that. It's just a little bit tricky. Now here I'm doing the other strap, and this is the alternative option, which is to just go all the way end to end, doing a back stitch each time. And that's just because you're going to get a perfect 1.5 centimeter seam allowance each time, and you don't need to use a ruler because you have that little paper guideline as a reference point. Now I want to show you a little tip on getting really crisp corners. So what I'm doing at the moment is I have turned this inside out. And if you look here, I'm just trying to push the corners out and they're just not as clean or as crisp as they could be. So turning it back inside out, let me show you how you do get a crisp corner, which is really just to cut away a little bit of that corner, but you need to make sure that you don't cut past that little orange highlighter point or your thread will unravel. So we want to get close to that corner, but not too close. So just remove those little bits and then I'll turn it inside out and show you what it looks like. Now that already looks way sharper than what we had before, and you can take it one step further by getting some pointy tweezers and pushing those corners through. However, it's just really important that you don't push through too hard, especially if you've cut too close or a hole will punch through. So just be mindful of that. So that's what a straight edge looks like for the ends of the bows. But if you want, you can take a little bit of artistic license here and have the ends of your bows angled if you want. I initially measured 10 centimeters up and cut this line, but found that it just wasn't as sharp as I would have liked. So I then went up another 2 centimeters, which is 12 centimeters total, and removed that little bit. Bringing that back across to your machine, same rules apply. Start with a back stitch, finish with a back stitch, use that seam allowance or little piece of paper guideline. Now same thing again, let's just remove that excess fabric so we can turn it inside out for a clean corner, making sure that we don't snip the actual thread line. All right, and now to an important point. If you want to elevate your sewing, you have to press your garments as you sew. Step by step, ensure that you're pressing. It's really going to elevate the quality and finish to your garments. Once you've done that, you're going to bring that across to the sewing machine because we're going to top stitch those edges. Now, hopefully you've warmed up into your sewing, that you're comfortable now to have a smaller seam allowance. So put your strap underneath the sewing foot, Place the sewing foot down, and I want you to have the edge of the strap flush to the edge of the sewing foot. This is a top stitch finish, and it just helps define the new edges that we've made, and they'll keep their shape in the garment. Now make sure you're using your left hand to keep the fabric nice and flat and your right hand to guide it through, making sure that you're staying nice and straight. However, if you're not doing it perfectly straight, that's okay, because you won't be using contrasting thread the way that I am. Your thread will match your fabric, so it will all look really good. Now, as you approach the corner, you don't want to go straight to the end, because our seam allowance needs to be maintained, which is probably about a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So just stop when you're about that distance away from the edge, put your pin down and pivot the fabric. And just repeat that process for both of the straps. Now, similar to pressing your garments, you also want to be making sure that you're working with clean edges. It's like having a clean workstation. Try to remove those excess threads as you go so that you don't get confused. Once you've done that, give both of the new straps a really good press. Obviously, by the way, you wouldn't have 2 different straps. Just do whichever strap appeals to you the most. Now it's time to move on to the main body of the bag. So I want you to grab pattern piece 1, which is our outer layer fabric. Now making sure that your pattern piece is facing the right way up and that our good facing fabric is on the inside kissing each other, and that we are currently looking at the bad side of the fabric if there is one. And from there you'll pin the right, bottom and left hand sides, not including the top. Across to our sewing machine, same seam allowance as the beginning, 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Make sure that you start with the back tack and you finish with a back tack, going from corner to corner. You're then going to pretty much repeat that exact same process, except we're doing the lining layer now, and you'll observe with the lining layer that we have 2 notches at the bottom. Those notches I included because they indicate the markers that you'll use as the opening. So pin the left perimeter, the right perimeter, and the bottom, stopping before the markers. So when you do the right hand border, you are starting with the back stitch and finishing with the back stitch. You are doing that same thing again, but twice for the bottom, and I'll show you what that looks like. So to our notch, which is our marker, that is where we're going to stop sewing. So stop with a back stitch. Now let's finish off that bottom perimeter. Start at the second notch and begin with a back stitch, go all the way to the end and finish with a back stitch. After that, you can then just close off the last side seam that we've got pinned. And then this is what you will be left with. So bringing in pattern piece 1 and looking at these 2, we're going to have to create little folds in the corners to create this little box shape. So I'll show you how to do that. If I turn this sample inside out, you'll see that I've just kind of pinched the corners together to create this little diagonal shape. So I'll talk you through that now. You just get one side, grab the other side, and you pull it open. However, as I'm pulling it open, I'm just getting this little bent shape at the top. So I'm just removing that corner so that it's easier for me to manipulate the fabric. You'll see here that I have one side seam facing me, currently going right, and underneath the other side seam is currently facing left. And that just helps give a smaller, thinner profile to my fabric. And I just get a pin and I try to place that right down the center of that thread line, making sure the pin is going straight down the seam on both sides so that I know that it's perfectly lining up. For this bag, I want to go 4 centimeters in from that little seam line and then pop some more pins in to make sure that it's really nice and flat. So let's just do that again. So I'm on the other corner now. I have cut through the fabric so that I can properly fold it. I'm facing the top seam allowance going right, the bottom seam allowance going left, and then I'm just going to grab a pin and make sure that it's going straight through the seam on both sides so that it's perfectly aligned. Grab your ruler and go 4 centimeters down from that little corner point and mark it. and then do a straight line across because that is exactly where we're going to stitch down on. Place a few more pins in, by the way, just as a little safety measure, making sure that you're definitely sewing on the right angles. And then just repeat this process for the outer layer of the bag. Now bring it across to your sewing machine, follow that little line that we drew, start with the back stitch, finish with the back stitch, and make sure that you remove the pins before you sew over them. Now let's just do that one more time and make sure that our direction of our seam allowance is facing one way and the underside is facing the other way. And then again, you'll repeat that process for the outer layer now. Now with that done, I want us to now define the new seams that we've created. So get your iron back out and define those edges with your iron for both the outer layer and the lining layer. Once you've done that, just grab the outer layer of fabric and the two straps that we've made. Getting that strap, fold it in half and put a little pin as a marker point of the center of the strap. And you're going to line that up with one of the side seams of the bag and pop some pins in to keep that in place. Then just turn that around and exact same thing again. Get the strap, find the center and sync that up in alignment with the center of the bag. Across to our sewing machine now, we're going to do a 1 centimeter seam allowance or 3/8 of an inch, and I will show you why that is later. So just begin with the back stitch, sew all the way down, and then finish with a back stitch. Repeating that for both sides. Once you've attached that, this is what you should be left with. This is the outer layer of the bag, and we're currently looking at the good side of the fabric. From there, get your lining layer and turn it inside out. To help us not get too confused, just get those little straps there and fold them so that they're the same length as the outer layer of the bag. You're then going to get the lining layer and put the outer layer inside of the lining layer. We are going to pin the top perimeter, but before we do that, we need to make sure that our bag is lining up nicely. So find the side seam on the lining layer and the side seam on the outer layer. Make sure that this one seam is going left and the other seam is going right to minimize the bulking profile, and place a pin right down the center. And then repeat that for the other side seam, and then you can go in with pins all around the top perimeter. Once we've pinned the top perimeter, we're then going to sew that close. So bring that across to our sewing machine. Now here, what you want to do is make sure we use a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and make sure that when you're sewing, we're definitely making sure that our seam allowance are facing alternate ways so that we don't have bulking on our side profile. Okay, sorry, when I say bulking, I mean the thickness of the fabric. By having this seam allowance currently going forward and then underneath the seam allowance going the opposite way, we're going through less layers of fabric. And this is important for two reasons. The one being is it actually just looks better as a finished product because you don't have a really bulky seam that's protruding, which is what I mean when I say thick profile. But the other reason is also cheaper sewing machines really struggle to get through lots and lots of layers of fabric. If you have a cheaper machine, it's very likely that it probably doesn't even go through denim. So less layers are your friend. Now, once you're done, this is what you will be left with, and I will show you that the straps that we did. Remember how we did them at a 1 centimeter seam allowance? This is why. Now that stitch that we did will be completely concealed by the 1.5 centimeter stitch now. Moving on from there, I want you to find that little opening that we made in the lining and pull your bag inside out. So first pull will look like this. Now we need to close the opening at the bottom of the bag. So just pull that nice and taut and then place some pins in the top perimeter. And then I also added some pins going in the other way as markers, just so that I could see my start point and my finish point. Now this is very similar to what we did when we closed the opening on our scrunchie. So locate that marker as our start point, do a back stitch, and as you can see here, I'm sewing as close as possible to the edge. Sew as close as possible that's comfortable for you, but it really just helps conceal this little opening. If you actually have any seamless tops or dresses and you look on the inside on them, either on the left or right side seam, you'll see a little stitch like this, and that's where the seamless garment has been closed. Okay, now we are on the home stretch. This is what that closed seam looks like on the lining. Push the lining through the bag. However, we need to now top stitch that top perimeter, otherwise the lining may accidentally poke through sometimes, and it'll just help us get a nice clean edge. And then I took it across to the sewing machine and I did a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and we know it's 1 centimeter because the edge of the foot is flush with the edge of the body of the bag. Just make sure you start with the back stitch, finish with the back stitch, and then make sure that you give that top perimeter a nice press as the last step. Now that is the end of the tutorial. Hopefully you have a bag like this that you love. I think it's a really good size for like fabric shopping, or like even if you go to uni, it would fit your laptop really well. However, take my advice that I mentioned earlier in the video and make sure you buy fabric for the stripes on a roll height that is at least 140 centimeters, because I forgot and I did not take my own advice, and you can see how short these straps are. On this bag, they go way lower, like they sit much longer, which I prefer. This is okay, but for how big the bag is, I think that the bow isn't big enough. So I think I'm gonna go to the shops and maybe make another bag. And I'll just post that on TikTok or Instagram in case that's where you are following me and that's how you're going to find out about the update that I've dropped this new pattern. Anyway, that is the end of the tutorial. So far we have made a scrunchie, this bag, and the next thing on the list is this dress. And considering it's Monday, I'll try to get the dress posted later in this week, but I'll post some real-time updates on Instagram. Outside of that, enjoy the sewing ahead, and I will see you later this week.